Welcome back to Audacious History, where we dig up the wildest, weirdest, and most badass stories the history books tried to gloss over. Today, we need to talk about the ultimate weapon of the Cold War. No, I'm not talking about the atomic bomb. I'm talking about that boxy, food-nuking contraption sitting on your kitchen counter right now, probably holding a half-eaten burrito. The microwave oven. The history you're taught in school tells you that the microwave was a happy little accident, a sweet, serendipitous moment of scientific discovery. But the real history, the history they didn't want you to know, it was an absolute shit show of military paranoia, high-stakes espionage, a literal exploding egg, and one incredibly pissed-off, self-taught engineer who had to outmaneuver the entire United States Pentagon, just so you could enjoy instant Pop-Tarts. Grab your snacks, because today we are going back to 1945. This is the story of Percy Spencer, the accidental history of the radar range, and how a blue-collar genius turned a top-secret doomsday device into the ultimate domestic cooking machine before the government could turn it into a death ray. To understand this story, you first have to understand who the hell Percy Spencer actually was. He wasn't some privileged Ivy League golden boy with 3 PhDs and a trust fund. Percy was born in the backwoods of Maine. His dad died when he was a toddler. His mother abandoned him, and he was raised by his aunt and uncle. When his uncle died, 12-year-old Percy left school to work at the spool mill to support the family. But Percy had a superpower. He was a savant with anything that had a wire running through it. When a local electricity plant was being installed in his town, he just stood there, watched the engineers, and taught himself how the grid worked. By the time he joined the U.S. Navy at 18, he had taught himself wireless radio technology by reading textbooks while standing night watches. The guy was a certified, self-taught, mechanical beast. Cut to World War II. Percy is working for Raytheon, a massive defensive contractor. Now, in 1945, the war is reaching its brutal, chaotic climax. The United States and its allies are locked in a tech race against Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. The atomic bomb is being built in secret, but there was another technology that was arguably just as critical to winning the war: radar. Radar stood for radio detection and ranging. It allowed the Allies to see enemy planes and submarines long before they could see us. And the beating, radioactive heart of the radar system was a little piece of high-tech wizardry called the cavity magnetron. The magnetron was a beast. It generated high-frequency radio waves, microwaves, that bounced off objects to track them. It was so top secret, so fiercely guarded, that engineers working on it were under constant military surveillance. The Pentagon was terrified that Axis spies would steal the tech. The labs at Raytheon were less like an office and more like a high-security pressure cooker. Scientists were working 18-hour days under the watchful, paranoid eyes of military generals who demanded more power, more distance, and more lethality. They wanted weapons to win the goddamn war, and they wanted them yesterday. Enter Percy Spencer. While the university-educated scientists were arguing over theoretical physics and advanced calculus, Percy was on the factory floor redesigning the manufacturing process. He took a machine that could only build 17 magnetrons a day and figured out a way to mass produce 2,600 of them a day. He was a hero to the company and a savior to the military. But Percy didn't care about the glory. Percy was tired, overworked, and most importantly, he was hungry. It was a brisk day in the fall of 1945. The lab was buzzing with the oppressive hum of active radar sets. High voltage electricity was pulsing through the room. Percy was doing his usual rounds, checking on a massive experimental magnetron that was cranked up to full power. This wasn't some tiny consumer electronics piece. This was a military-grade beast designed to pierce through Atlantic storms and spot enemy U-boats. Percy stood directly in front of the active tube, inspecting the connections. He didn't feel anything. No heat, no tingling, no warning signs. Because that's the thing about microwaves. They are invisible, silent, and totally undetectable to human skin until the damage is already done. Now, Percy had a bit of a sweet tooth. In his lab coat pocket, he had stashed his afternoon fuel, a peanut cluster bar. After inspecting the magnetron, he reached into his pocket to grab his snack. But instead of a solid, crunchy bar of chocolate and nuts, his fingers sank into a warm, gooey, disgusting sludge. Most people would have cursed, wiped their hands on their pants, and gone to find a towel. But Percy wasn't most people. His hyper-analytic brain instantly went into overdrive. He knew the lab wasn't hot. He knew his body temperature hadn't skyrocketed. So why the hell was his chocolate bar completely melted while his pants were completely fine? He looked at the magnetron. He looked at his pocket. He looked back at the magnetron. Holy shit, he thought. The invisible, high-frequency radio waves meant to track enemy fighter planes weren't just bouncing off things. They were transferring energy. They were generating heat deep inside organic matter. They were cooking. Think about the sheer audacity of this moment. The world is engulfed in the most destructive conflict in human history. The military is breathing down Percy's neck to turn this exact technology into a more efficient way to kill people. And Percy? Percy looks at this terrifying, invisible cosmic radiation and thinks, I bet I could use this to make a really good toasted sandwich. Percy knew he was on to something big, but he needed proof. He couldn't just walk up to the executives at Raytheon and say, hey, my lunch melted. Give me $1 million. He needed an experiment, a controlled, scientific, and slightly dangerous experiment. The next morning, Percy snuck a brown paper bag into the top secret facility. Inside the bag, a handful of raw popping corn kernels. Popcorn. He placed the bag directly in front of the magnetron tube. He walked over to the control panel, his hand hovering over the heavy master switch. He cranked the power up to maximum. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The lab was dead silent, save for the deep, ominous drone of the power generators. And then, pop! Pop, 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 pop! Within less than a minute, the brown paper bag was violently expanding, tearing at the seams. Fluffy, white, perfectly popped corn came bursting out of the bag, bouncing off the $1 million military equipment, scattering across the grease-stained floor of the high-security defense lab. Percy's assistants stood there, their jaws on the floor, watching atomic-age military tech do the work of a carnival snack cart. Percy just stood there, picked up a piece from the floor, popped it into his mouth, and smiled. It worked perfectly. But Percy was a true scientist. Popcorn was easy. Popcorn had low moisture. He needed a real challenge. He needed to see what these waves would do to something high in liquid content. He needed an egg. Now, if you have ever tried to microwave a whole egg in its shell, you already know this is a terrible, horrible, no good idea. But in 1945, there was no warning label on the box. Percy was writing the warning label with his own life choices. Enter Edward. Edward was one of those classic, overeducated, underexperienced junior engineers assigned to the lab. The kind of guy who wore a pristine white lab coat without a single grease stain and looked down on Percy because Percy didn't have a fancy degree. Edward thought Percy's little food experiments were a colossal waste of time and military resources. On this particular morning, Edward walked into the lab, clipboard in hand, looking to badger Percy about some delayed radar reports. Let's look at exactly how this confrontation went down. What in God's name are you doing now? The Pentagon is expecting the diagnostic metrics on the airborne radar grids by 0800, and I find you messing around with... Is that a bloody breakfast ingredient? Back off, Edward. I'm running a highly critical thermal velocity test. A thermal velocity test? It's an egg, Spencer. A common hen's egg. This is a military defense facility, not a damn diner. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble we'll be in if General Melrose walks in here and sees you playing with your groceries? We are supposed to be perfecting a weapon to intercept enemy aircraft, and you're treating a multi-million-dollar magnetron like a campfire. I suggest you take a step back, kid. I will absolutely not step back. This is absurd. Look at it. Nothing is even happening. There's no heat source, no flame, no induction coil. You've lost your mind, Spencer. The pressure of the war has finally cracked your... Boom! The egg didn't just crack, it violently, catastrophically detonated. Because microwaves heat water molecules inside food instantly, the liquid inside the egg turned to steam in a fraction of a second. With nowhere for the pressure to go, the shell couldn't hold it. The egg became a localized, organic hand grenade. And because Edward was leaning in, playing the smartass, he took the full force of the blast right to the face. You psychopath! You weaponized breakfast! I told you to step back, Edward. But on the bright side, look at how fast it cooked. The yolk is perfectly set. Hey, do me a solid and support independent history storytelling by hitting that subscribe button. Done it? Awesome. Let's get back to the madness. After the Great Egg Explosion of 1945, word started to leak out. You can't detonate breakfast in a high-security military lab without people asking questions. The higher-ups at Raytheon were starting to get suspicious, and worse, the military generals overseeing the project were growing deeply paranoid. You have to remember the context of late 1945. The war was ending, but the Cold War was already brewing. The military brass didn't see a convenient way to heat up leftovers. They saw something far more sinister. Generals from the Pentagon began visiting the Raytheon facilities. They had caught wind of Percy's experiments with invisible localized heat. Their minds immediately jumped to sci-fi superweapons. They thought Percy had invented a localized thermal ray, a weapon that could be mounted on a jeep or an airplane to instantly melt enemy brains, detonate ammunition stockpiles from a mile away, or boil the blood of opposing soldiers in their trenches. The military wanted to classify Percy's research as a top-secret national defense asset. If they did that, the technology would be locked in a vault in Washington, buried under mountains of red tape, and destined to become a classified weapon of destruction. Percy would never be allowed to talk about it, let alone build it for the public. Percy was horrified by this. He wasn't a pacifist. He had helped win the war with his radar production. But he was a builder. He saw a future where every home in America could cook a meal in minutes. He saw a revolution for working-class housewives, for busy families, for restaurants. He refused to let his discovery become another tool for killing. So Percy did something incredibly risky. He went rogue. He started moonlighting inside his own lab, playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse with military inspectors. Whenever the generals were in the building, Percy would hide his cooking prototypes under heavy canvas tarps and pile radar schematics on top of them. He would pretend he was working on advanced waveguides for military communication. But the second the suits left the room, the tarps came off and Percy was back to testing how the magnetron affected pork chops, potatoes, and soup. He was locked in a literal race against time. If the military claimed the technology first under wartime emergency acts, Raytheon would be forced to hand over all intellectual property to the government. Percy needed to build a working prototype, file a commercial patent, and prove its domestic viability before the Pentagon could stamp top secret on its files. He worked through the night, sleeping on a cot in the corner of the lab. He faced constant pushback from the company's bean counters who thought he was wasting valuable copper and vacuum tubes on a pipe dream. But Percy kept pushing, refining the design, enclosing the magnetron in a safe, shielded metal box so the waves couldn't escape, saving future generations from having their own faces exploded like poor Edward. By late 1945, Percy Spencer did what everyone thought was impossible. He won the race. He filed for a patent on the use of high-frequency radio waves to cook food. Raytheon, realizing the absolute gold mine they were sitting on, backed Percy and fought off the military's attempts to classify the technology. The Pentagon had to settle for their atomic bombs. Percy got to keep his kitchen gadget. In 1947, Raytheon released the very first commercial microwave oven. They didn't call it a microwave, though. They gave it a name that sounded straight out of a sci-fi serial: the Radar Range. But if you think the Radar Range was an instant success, you are dead wrong. This thing was an absolute unit. It stood nearly 6 feet tall. It weighed a staggering 750 pounds. And the price tag? It cost $5,000 in 1947 money. Adjusted for inflation today, that is over $60,000 for a single kitchen appliance. Unless you were a high-end luxury cruise liner, a massive commercial restaurant, or a billionaire with too much cash to burn, you weren't buying a Radar Range. On top of all that, it required its own dedicated plumbing system because the massive magnetron tube inside generated so much heat it had to be constantly water-cooled by pipes running from the wall. Imagine needing a plumber just to install a machine to heat up your frozen pizza. It was a logistical nightmare for the average household. But Percy Spencer didn't give up. Over the next 2 decades, he and his team of engineers worked tirelessly to do what engineers do best: make it smaller, make it cheaper, and make it safer. By the late 1960s and early 70s, the technology had advanced enough that the water cooling system was replaced by simple air fans. The price dropped from the price of a suburban house to something the average middle-class family could actually afford. Suddenly, the machine born from the blood, sweat, and paranoia of World War II was in every home in America. It completely transformed the global food industry. It gave birth to the TV dinner, revolutionized processed foods, and changed the way humanity eats forever. Percy Spencer passed away in 1970. He held over 300 patents in his lifetime, received the Distinguished Public Service Award from the U.S. Navy, and was eventually inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Not bad for a kid who dropped out of school at 12 to work in a spool mill. So the next time you pop a bag of popcorn or heat up some questionable leftovers at 2 o'clock in the morning, take a good look at that little spinning glass plate inside your microwave. Remember that you aren't just using a kitchen appliance. You are using a modified, domesticated piece of high-tech World War II military hardware. A device that was saved from the clutches of the Pentagon because one hungry engineer had a chocolate bar in his pocket, a rogue spirit in his heart, and the utter audacity to explode an egg right in his colleague's face. Thanks for watching Audacious History. If you like this story, make sure to give us a like, drop a comment below telling us the craziest thing you've ever accidentally exploded in a microwave, and check out my other videos right here. Until next time, keep it audacious, stay curious, And for the love of God, don't microwave a whole egg. See you next time.